Hello, everybody. Today is Wednesday night, August 21st at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, which means it's time for another episode of Mass Office Hours brought to you by the Mass Research Review. A new tradition. I'm going to begin with a complaint, Mike. I am going to reprimand the audience and complain to the audience. Last week, we did a show, and we streamed at probably the lowest definition, the lowest quality stream that's been attempted in over a decade. I think listeners who are paying attention could probably count the pixels on their screen. That's because earlier that day I was messing around with the settings on my computer and didn't realize the ramifications of that. But here's why I'm shifting all the blame to the audience. Folks, we have a live operation here, and we are literally chatting with you during the show. You gotta let me know if we are streaming with the quality of a potato with two wires sticking out of it, because I can't promise that I can fix every problem, but that one I definitely could have got. So, folks, this is a reminder to the good people. If you're ever watching and saying, hey, this sounds or looks terrible, let me know, and we'll see what we can do about that. But I'm really glad to be able to pass that blame off to the audience. It certainly has nothing to do with me. But tonight is a new show, and we are hopefully streaming an ultra high definition. And I am joined by the good Dr. Mike Zourdos. Mike, it's been a few weeks since you've been on the show. Is that correct?
Yeah, it has been. Obviously, the audience didn't know about this, but essentially I was in protest of your heavy-handed reign of the show, and I just boycotted for a while. Unfortunately, nobody joined the boycott with me. I was out there all on my own, and so I've decided to come crawling back to hopefully still have a spot here on the show. But mainly it was due to, at first, having to play the 8-year-old basketball playoffs, which fell on a Wednesday night. When I say play, I'm the same height as the kids, so if somebody's not there, I just go in the game. No, we didn't make the playoffs, but my coaching ended up in a first-round exit, among some other things the past few weeks. So it's been a while, but I'm excited to be back. Thanks for still having me back after my, ranting and raving, and still having me on.
And I believe, didn't Mass sponsor that team?
They did. So the Mass Research Review
do we get a portion of our contribution back since you guys were a first round bounce from the playoffs?
So this was my fear, right? This is what I didn't want. You're like when Jerry Jones comes down from the box and stands on the sidelines and just watches over, like in the early 2000s, he would just watch over Dave Campo and those 4-12 Dallas Cowboys teams just in disapproval. And this is what I was concerned about. This ownership coming in, this is probably why we lost in the first round. We weren't feeling comfortable. You're trying to head, you and Helms and Lauren are trying to have insight into who should play. That's the coach's job. It's not the GM. It's not the owners. And here you guys were just not letting us go ahead and do our thing. So, you just Jerry Jones'd it. You Arthur Blanked it, just trying to, meddle in what we were doing. And I didn't appreciate it. And so I'm putting the blame on the owners.
Well, there's two ways to look at that. One would be that the Cowboys under Jerry Jones have largely been disappointing on the field. The other is that they are a tremendously valuable franchise. Yeah. And ultimately, as someone who provided the seed funding for this organization, this 8-year-old basketball team, that's really what I'm interested in, is the bottom line. So hopefully we can follow in Jerry's footsteps. And much like his situation, I actually played youth basketball back in the day, so I also feel entitled to tell you what to do all the time.
Were your snacks also a lot of Capri Sun?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah,
of course.
You can get
that's really what the kids want, is they want to know who's bringing snacks.
Yeah, usually it'd be like the Capri Sun and an orange wedge, but every now and then you get the parent who would bring like just a bunch of heavy donuts, and you get those in the middle of the day on like a double header. And
you get that. Here's my last comment on this. So as you know, my wife is a dietitian, right? And so when it would be like, who's bringing snacks? Like Dominic's parents, yay. Jack's parents, yay. Who's bringing snacks? Zach's mom. The kids would go, oh. She would be like, we have to bring healthy snacks, guys. And the kids would never want them. It was amazing.
Yeah, definitely. All right, Mike, let's dive in here and give the good people what they want. We're already pushing it with football talk. I talked a little bit about college football last week. So,
All right.
all right. So, folks, before I get into it, you know the drill. If you like the show, you want to support it, there are many ways to do that. Make sure you like, rate, subscribe, review. Share the link with a friend. We put this on YouTube. We put it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all that stuff. And of course, if you want to contribute to the show, you can join us in the live chat and ask us questions, or you can submit after hours using our portal at massresearchreview.com/office hours. And then finally, if you really love what we're doing, obviously the Mass Research Review makes this whole thing possible, so you should at least consider becoming a subscriber to the Mass Research Review. When you subscribe, of course, you get our newest work as it comes out. But on top of that, you get access to the whole archive, which I think, Mike, is over 1,000 pieces of content now.
Yes, sir. Over 1,000.
Yeah, so it's been going. We're in our 8th year of operation, and it just keeps getting better and better. Now, Mike, to kick us off here, I understand that you've got a little presentation, so to speak, little segment here about volume cycling, which we get a lot of questions about, right? Because volume, a lot of people tie it to, this big time primary driver of hypertrophy. And so as a result, people want more growth, they want more volume, but then they kind of paint themselves into a corner. And they say, I'm doing the most volume I could possibly do right now because of practical constraints, or I'm not recovering well. And then they say, well, now what? I was told that more volume is more growth, but I got nowhere to go but down from here, right? So you're going to introduce the topic of volume cycling, which is probably a more realistic way to approach leveraging volume fluctuations in a program.
Absolutely. And so kind of what spurred this discussion for tonight is that coming out on September 1st in the Mass Research Review, I have a training guide entitled Massive Training Guide, What is Volume Cycling and How to Use It. Something I've really enjoyed lately is writing these training guides for issues of mass, whether it's related to split and full body programs, whether it's related to time efficient training strategies. But in terms of volume cycling, and so I'll give as much away as I can here. You'll have to subscribe if you're not already, become a member to read that in the issue. But when we talk about volume cycling, I first want to start kind of at the baseline and go ahead and say, all right, so what is that relationship between volume and hypertrophy? And why should we consider something like volume cycling? Why is that a thing we're even bringing up? Well, as Trex said, and obviously we're all aware of this, there's a fairly strong relationship between volume and hypertrophy in a positive direction. Of course, more volume to a point is related to more growth. Now, what is that? Well, we have the old Schoenfeld meta-analysis, the classic meta from 2017, which said 10 plus sets per week per muscle group, right? But all right, there wasn't that much data at the time. That's not too specific. The researchers did a great job. There just wasn't enough data to conclude if more than that was okay. In the past couple of years, Baz Valley had a systematic review saying, okay, 10 to 20 sets per week. We have more data now. We can say up to 20 sets per week per muscle group to maximize muscle growth. For the triceps, they concluded in that study perhaps a little bit more. For the other muscle groups, they didn't have enough data to be able to say, should there be more than that? Since then, we have a few other studies, whether it's the Brigado study, whether it's the NS study, that are showing 40 some sets per week, even 50 sets per week. Another study from Schoenfeld from a few years back, I think 2019, showing over 40 sets per week. These kinds of sets can maximize muscle growth, they're suggesting. Now, that's not enough evidence to say, all right, this is how we have to train or how we have to go with it all the time. But it is evidence to suggest that, hey, this top end of sets from the Schoenfeld and then from the Baz Valley systematic review is perhaps a little bit higher than that. We just didn't quite have enough data yet to do that. So let's say you're going to do something like really high volumes and you say, all right, I want to do 30 or 40 sets per muscle group per week to be able to maximize muscle growth. Well, okay, that's great, but there's a few things on this. Is that sustainable at all times? Right? If you're going to do that, that's probably not something you're going to want to do on all muscle groups year round. Additionally, there is some data out there that's suggesting that if you actually back off of volume at times, you will desensitize muscle to that higher volume. And then if you increase it again, perhaps you can get a bit more growth out of it. And so because of that potential desensitization effect and just the practical effect of saying, hey, I can't sustain 40 plus sets per week year round on this muscle all the time. Perhaps you want a volume cycle. And we could characterize volume cycling just as it sounds, as periods of, let's say, using baseline or normal volume and then increasing volume and then going back to a more maintenance or lower volume. And so that would be volume cycling. Now, here's a general, before I get into more specifics, and what I want to talk about with this is how you'd want to kind of mix and match muscle groups. So you are volume cycling some muscle groups into high volume at certain times, and then using lower volumes at other times. And then when you're doing that, you're being very conscious of how much you're increasing volume at certain times. But here's the baseline kind of how this would be structured. You have normal volume, and then you're going to go ahead and increase volume for, let's say, 8 weeks, maybe deload, then increase volume again for 8 more weeks. And then you go to baseline volume on all muscle groups for 4 weeks. Now, in the first blocks where you increase volume, you probably increase it on some muscle groups, let's say chest, shoulders, biceps. And then after you bring those muscles back down to baseline, then you increase volume on legs, back, and biceps. So to be a bit more specific, how this would work is saying, all right, I'm going into a volume cycling phase, and my split is chest, shoulders, and triceps Mondays and Thursdays, and legs, back, and biceps on Tuesdays and Fridays. So I'm going to go ahead and increase that volume for, let's say, 8 weeks, 10 weeks on chest, shoulders, and triceps, and perform a maintenance volume on legs, back, and biceps. And then after that, deload and then flip them. So legs, back, and biceps peak volume, and chest, shoulders, and triceps are more at a maintenance volume. Now, when you're doing this, be careful about how much you increase volume or set volume at one time. So we have evidence that increasing set volume by about 20% can be effective, more effective than just doing the same kind of volume across everybody to increase muscle growth. So I would say you probably wouldn't want to increase volume more than about 20 to 40% in the course of a volume cycling block, or the first week of a volume cycling block. So what I mean by that is, to me, if you're usually doing, let's say, 10 sets per week on a muscle group, and when you go into a volume cycling block, you would now be doing 12 sets per week. But that's only for week 1. So you could increase, and if you only increase 20% and sustain that for 8 weeks, that's not really volume cycling. That's not that much. So what I would probably do is say, all right, I'm doing, 20 sets per week on these chest, shoulders, and triceps. And then when I go to week 1 of the volume cycling block, I would increase that set volume by 20%. And then for week 2, or let's say maybe more than that, maybe 30%. Then for week 2 by 25%. Then for week 3 by 20%, week 4 by 15%, week 5 by 10%. Now, all of a sudden, depending on what your absolute volume is, you've added 6, 7, 8, 9 sets, and you've gradually done it. Then sustain once you've added maybe those 8 or 9 sets for another 5 weeks or so. And there's your volume cycling block. Bring that back down to more maintenance volume. And then you can kick those other muscle groups up to a volume cycling the way you just did. So you can gradually do it. And if we think to the literature, like the NS study, for example, which I covered in a video on mass, and I talked about extensively on office hours back, I think in maybe late 2023, is that study is the study now famous that worked up to 52 plus sets per week on the lower body. They didn't do the 52 sets for the entire study over the 10 weeks. They gradually worked up to that, right? So that's what I'm advocating here with volume cycling. It's not just, hey, I'm doing 10 sets per week. Next week, I'm doing 25 sets per week. No, I'm doing 10 sets per week on chest, shoulders, and triceps. Next week, I'm doing 12 sets. Next week, I'm doing 14. And I'm gradually increasing that while legs, back, and biceps stay at 10. After that, you deload, you bring those back to maintenance volume, and then you increase legs, back, and biceps. And so that's kind of the basic general outline of how I'd go about volume cycling. But what I also want to get at, which I think is really important, and I wrote about this in the guide that I have coming out, and I'm really proud of this guide because it puts together very specific programs and very specific examples of exactly how you would do this. But the other thing I talked about in the guide is that and this is outside of just volume cycling, there's a cost to almost any programming change that you make. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, if you say, all right, for example, this is a little bit of a different concept, but you want to get a little bit more out of each set. So you say, hey, based upon, the Robinson meta-regression, I'm going to take my sets to failure or closer to failure. That's fine. And that is based upon the data that's come out. However, what's the cost associated? Perhaps a little bit more fatigue, right? And even if you can adapt to that fatigue, maybe a little bit more mental stress, just getting ready for each set. So if you're going to do that, then you say, all right, maybe I'm training a little bit less frequently so I can take these sets to failure. Or maybe I can only take one day to failure because I'm a bit more fatigued on the other day. If you're going to do volume cycling, there's a similar cost of fatigue perhaps, or there's a cost of a lot of time in the gym because of being able to do all the more volume and all these more sets. So what I would always advocate when making a change like this is to be cognizant of what I call downstream programming changes. For example, if you're going to end up, increasing your set volume by 40, 50% over the course of a volume cycling block, well, then you're going to want to be cognizant about maybe I don't do all of these sets to failure. Or maybe I'm doing so much volume in one day, or I'm training more frequently now that I'm going to be conscious of where I put something like an RDL during the week, because that's a long muscle length. I'm going to be a bit fatigued. It's unlikely in 48 hours after doing a bunch of RDLs, I'm going to come back and be able to train hamstrings really, really effectively. So I'm going to move those RDLs to, let's say, Friday, because then I have the weekend off before I'm going to train this muscle group again on Monday. Other programmatic changes could be, all right, I'm doing all this volume cycling. Maybe I use some time efficient strategies so I'm not in the gym forever. Another programming kind of change, downstream change you might make is, well, I was doing a chest, shoulders, and triceps split and legs, back, and biceps split, but I'm going to change to an upper lower split. Why is that? Well, with an upper lower split, agonist, antagonist supersets become much easier because now you're training chest and back together. So you can save a lot of time. When you're volume cycling, you have a lot more sets to do, and you can superset rows and bench presses. You can superset, leg curls and leg extensions, things like that when you're on an upper lower split. So for volume cycling, because there's some evidence that muscle can be desensitized and then resensitized when volume is increased again, and because even if 30, 40, 50 sets per week or something like that are acceptable or even necessary, let's say, to maximize muscle growth in some individuals, I don't think it's sustainable all the time. I don't think it's sustainable year round. And I don't think you'd probably want to do that on all muscle groups all the time. So I'd recommend, if you're interested in this, I'm not saying that nobody should take away from this and saying, hey, Zourdos is saying, everybody needs to hammer home 40 sets per week. I'm not saying that's right for you. I'm saying if you were already going to make the decision to do something like that, I might advocate volume cycling. So kicking up some muscle groups, keeping others at maintenance volume. And when you do kick up some of that volume, be cognizant of those downstream changes. Understand there's a cost to doing so much more volume. It could be the fatigue, whether that's physical, whether that's mental. It could be time. In that case, you put in the time efficient programming strategies. Be conscious of training to failure. You be conscious of your exercise selection. If you're putting in so much more volume, right, perhaps if your goal is hypertrophy, instead of all of the free weights, you put in a lot more machines. It's probably a bit easier to add some sets doing that. We know there isn't a difference in general between machines and free weights for muscle growth. So there's a cost to that. So I'd be careful about how we do it if we're going to embark on that strategy of volume cycling. But nonetheless, we do need longitudinal data on volume cycling to be able to really pinpoint home if this is effective in the long run. This is a theory at the moment. So it's theoretically a good idea. It's something that people are using in practice. So I wanted to be able to put out there a guide to say, hey, based upon the kind of acute evidence that we have, here's the best way I would go about it, taking these things into account. But to be clear, this is a theory and we need that long-term data. But very intriguing at the moment. I very much enjoyed writing that guide. Dr. Trexler, I don't know if you have any questions on this before we move on, but that's what I have for you.
No, I think that was a great overview. I was looking through the chat to see if there were any related questions or follow-up questions. But no, I think we're good. And I'll continue to monitor that, see if anybody chimes in with a question about this topic. With that said, Mike, what do you say we dive into the live chat? How's that sound?
Would love to.
Beautiful. So, right off the bat, Mike, I know you want to answer this one about saturated fat, but I do want to make sure I get my money's worth tonight. So I'm going to actually jump in and take this one. Okay.
Fine, if you have to.
I mean, really, we should call your wife in, but,
We should.
Yeah. All right. So, got a question here. You previously mentioned that there are differential health effects of different saturated fats. Could you go into more detail on this? For example, someone who's getting all their saturated fat from nuts and dairy, would they theoretically be able to get away with eating more saturated fat without having, similar blood lipid issues compared to someone who is getting all their saturated fat from meat? And then also, what about fish? So there's a good reason that a lot of people have heard kind of vague statements about this, but haven't gotten a lot of really direct information about it. Not a lot of like simple guides and targets. And the reason for that is because it's kind of complicated. I definitely don't want to sugarcoat it. And the reason it's complicated is because when you look at a food source of saturated fat, you are also looking at a food source of a bunch of other stuff, right? We don't just eat saturated fat sources as just a giant floating blob of saturated fat. We usually eat something that comes with fat, maybe some carbohydrate and fiber, probably a little bit of protein. If not in the food matrix itself, then certainly in the meal that it's commonly consumed in. So we should be really cautious about taking foods out of the context in which we actually eat them. But I will give you some guidance here. So first, I want to quote a paper by Schramko and colleagues. And in that paper, they note that stearic and lauric acids increase all the cholesterol fractions, that is total cholesterol, LDL, HDL, the LDL to HDL ratio, triglycerides, apolipoprotein A, apolipoprotein B. So stearic and lauric acids increase all of those to a greater extent than palmitic acid, and palmitic acid increases all those cholesterol fractions more so than stearic acid. So just to give some context there, when we are talking about lauric acid, a lot of times we're getting that from coconut oil. When we're talking about palmitic acid, a lot of times we're talking about getting that from palm oil, but also some in butter, meat, milk, and cheese as well. When we talk about stearic acid, we're talking about, in many cases, the saturated fat that's coming from meat, poultry, fish, things like that. So you could kind of go through fatty acid by fatty acid and then go through lipid fraction by lipid fraction and try to figure out, what kind of perfect combination of those is going to be kind of your sweet spot. I think that's going to be tough. The reason being a lot of different foods that do have high saturated fat, they actually have a combination of those saturated fatty acids, right? So they're going to have a combination of maybe lauric and palmitic and stearic acid, some, mix and match of these different saturated fatty acids. So for example, you could think of like, hey, fish oil. I'm going to eat a big old fatty piece of salmon because I want to get some omega-3. But you're getting a heck of a lot more fatty acids in there than just EPA or DHA. You're getting a whole complement of other fatty acids that make up all the fat within that serving of fish. So a different way to look at this is to kind of zoom out and look at meta-analyses that look at, for example, outcomes of interest that are more clinically relevant. So instead of looking at the relationship between a single fatty acid in isolation and a single fraction of your blood lipids, maybe looking at HDL or LDL, you could zoom out and say, I want to look at, for example, the relationship between milk intake and mortality, or meat intake and mortality, or processed meat or cheese and mortality, right? So there's actually a study, a meta-analysis by O'Sullivan and colleagues back in 2013, when they looked at different types of mortality. So they were looking at, cardiovascular mortality, total mortality, and cancer mortality. And they were looking at all these different, the relationship with all these different types of food categories that tend to be high in saturated fat to see if there was perhaps a difference in terms of how they impacted some of these health-related endpoints, rather than looking at really hyper-specific biomarkers. And generally speaking, what they found was processed meat, not what you want, generally associated with some unfavorable outcomes with mortality. Unprocessed meat still was associated with increased risk, but not to the same extent as processed meat. And what they found was that whether you're looking at cardiovascular mortality or all-cause mortality, milk and cheese actually were not associated with increased risk. And so it's really fascinating. So what we can say is, different sources of fat, of saturated fat, we shouldn't just categorically say, hey, that food is bad for you because it has saturated fat. Even foods that contain some of the more impactful saturated fatty acids, and when I say impactful, I mean basically having deleterious impacts on your blood lipids. Even those foods, we shouldn't broadly categorize them as unhealthy, right? If you look at all the different guidelines for, healthy eating indicator and, all the different tables they put together of what a healthy diet looks like, I really roll my eyes at any that would say you cannot have any red meat as part of a healthy diet. Most of the really legit dietary guidelines will say, well, no, you want to moderate your consumption of, fatty red meat. You probably do want to limit your consumption of processed meat, essentially as much as you can. That generally is a pretty solid recommendation, but it's certainly not advisable to say that saturated fat should be avoided across the board. And frankly, I don't think we have enough evidence yet to provide really granular recommendations where we say, forget about the classic guideline to limit saturated fat to no more than 10% of your calories. You should be getting no more than 4% of your calories from stearic acid. You're not going to find, at least I don't expect, a lot of folks out there who feel really comfortable giving hyper-specific guidelines that actually are going fatty acid by fatty acid. Now, if you, for example, like I said, the common recommendation for saturated fat intake is to limit it to no more than 10% of your calories. I would just kind of qualitatively say, if your saturated fat intake was making up, let's say 12% of your caloric intake, but you were eating a lot of nuts, you were eating a lot of dairy products, milk and cheese and yogurt, and your intake of processed meats was extremely low, you were eating fatty meats and fish in moderation, if that's kind of what your dietary pattern looks like and your blood lipids are in good shape, based on the things I mentioned previously, I would not be stressed about saying, oh God, I'm at 12% instead of 9 or 10. So you have to kind of take all that stuff in context. And so when people ask me, like, of the things that could contain saturated fat, what food sources tend to be the most health promoting versus the most deleterious? I think it's really hard to try to make fish look bad in a diet. Same thing for nuts, assuming that you're eating an appropriate amount of calories per day, because they are very energy dense. But fish, nuts, poultry, really any lean cut of meat, eggs, cheese, dairy, these things generally are, components of health promoting diets. The main things that you want to avoid, in my opinion, are a diet that's really, really heavy in fatty red meat, a diet that's really heavy in processed meats, and then, of course, a diet that's going to be really heavy in some of those just kind of ultra-processed, hyper-palatable sweets and treats that also tend to carry some saturated fat with them. So when I was a little kid, Mike, the Little Debbie, those little snacks, you get the little zebra cakes and the ho-hos, and I'm sure I'm probably mentioning some Hostess products mixed in there with Little Debbie's, the Nutty Buddy. Man, when I was a kid, as far as I could tell, that was the best food could get. You know what I mean? Like that, when some people go into like a Michelin star restaurant, that was me walking through the like little Debbie aisle of the grocery store, which was great because those things apparently never go bad. So they would always be there waiting for me. They've got a shelf life of about 75 years. But yeah, you probably don't want to be getting a lot of your fat from those types of foods either. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful. I know it's not quite as satisfying as someone who will just come out and say, you know, yeah, here are these 3 heuristics that are super simple. But I think one of the things we try to do in Mass, Mike, is we want to make complex things as simple as we can, but we also don't want to basically sacrifice nuance in the sake of just saying, well, reality's complicated, so I'll just replace it with something simple that's not actually true. You know, so I'd love to be able to give a much more direct kind of heuristic where I could say, yeah, you can do this many of that and this many of the other. The reality is there's a lot more work that needs to be done there. And frankly, even if that work does get done, it'll probably be done in the context of nutritional epidemiology. And it's going to be darn near impossible to separate out the effects of individual saturated fatty acids from the overall matrix of that food, which is going to include fiber and antioxidants. And, you know, some will contain sugars. You know, some of them are going to be, you know, charred meats that carry all sorts of other issues. So it's going to be messy. And I think leaning on those kind of higher level outcomes and more general observations about food patterns is probably the right way to go. Mike, do you know anything about menopause?
Not my area of study. I learned a little bit in some classes I took in the medical school during my PhD, but not my area of study.
Yeah, be careful with that, Mike. So you dropped a hard MS there. You dropped the old medical school term, and only I'm allowed to do that because my PhD technically came from the School of Medicine. So I like to always tell people about back when I was working on my doctorate in the medical school. And maybe some people might happen to infer that I'm a medical doctor. I don't know. I can't say what assumptions they're jumping to.
You don't say you are.
No, I talk about when I was doing my doctorate in medical school.
Right.
Yes.
Right. It's like the guitar I have over here. When people come in and say, "Hey, nice guitar," they assume I play. I don't say I play.
Right.
I just say, "Yeah, thanks."
You say, yeah, I just wish it didn't give me so many calluses on my fingertips. But that doesn't mean that you necessarily play. But anyway, so it's very unfortunate that this question was asked on a night where Lauren wasn't here, because Lauren really is tapped into the literature, surrounding sex hormones, and particularly female sex hormones. So she would definitely be the most qualified person on the Mass team to give an answer here. So what I'm going to do is half punt on this question, but also give something that's at least somewhat useful. So whenever I get questions like this, I like to do a little bit of reframing, Mike, and I say, if we're not a researcher who's going to be kind of designing a study based on the answer to this question, then what exactly are we using this for, right? So if we get the answer, so the question is, I should go ahead and read that. Is there any scientific validity to the idea that peri/menopausal women have a harder time losing body fat? Are those anecdotes attributable entirely to lifestyle changes? So I certainly am not saying it's a bad question, but again, I always, when I get questions like this and I don't know the answer and I can't just tell you what the literature says, I like to at least take a step back and reframe it and say, what are we going to do with the answer to this question, right? Because I could either tell you that dieting for peri or menopausal women is harder or not harder. But at the end of the day, that answer shouldn't really dictate whether or not weight loss is an appropriate intervention for any given individual, right? Also, weight loss, we know from the literature, is hard. like pretty much always. So it's not like we're going to be changing the way that we frame or discuss weight loss with someone who is peri or postmenopausal, right? So I would push back a little bit in terms of, the perceived application or utility of the answer we would get from this, because I think sometimes the answer is used in a way that's really discouraging, really deflating. And instead, usually if I, for example, had a client who asked me this, I would spend some time talking with them about where the question is coming from. Maybe it is, well, I'm having a much harder time with my weight loss now than I did when I was younger, and I am going through menopause currently. I'm wondering if that might be contributing. And so you kind of start entering this conversation, and you start to say, okay, well, I will look into the literature and figure out the level of support within the scientific base of evidence there. But for now, our real question is, or our real problem statement is, weight loss is challenging right now, and it's part of our goal, and we need to figure out what our biggest barriers are and how we're going to circumvent those barriers, right? So I know that that's a complete non-answer, but I also think it is important when you find yourself asking this type of thing. As a coach, am I approaching weight loss totally differently for a woman going through menopause versus someone who is not? Not really. I know it's going to be hard no matter what. And the exact challenges or barriers we run into could be different, but that's not really going to change our approach in a substantive way, nor is it going to change how seriously I take it when someone tells me, hey, I'm trying to do the weight loss program that we discussed, and I'm really having a hard time with it. So all that is to say, I'm going to lean on Lauren, who knows this literature a lot better than I do in terms of a real substantive answer to this question. But in the meantime, I would encourage folks, whether peri/postmenopausal or not, to really, approach weight loss in a similar manner in terms of the overall mindset, understanding this is going to be really challenging. If you're a coach, understand that your clients are going to face challenges during weight loss, regardless of what, physiological state they happen to be at, what stage of life they happen to be at. So yeah, it's always important to keep those things in mind. And hopefully within the next few weeks, Lauren will be on and we'll get a good answer to that. All right. Another question here, Mike, I'm going to answer really quickly. This one's come up a few times. So listen to old episodes if you want more of a elaborate explanation here. But the question is, how important is the consistency of a surplus during a bulk? For example, can I be in a small deficit on weekdays and then a large surplus on weekends and end up with similar results compared to just having a small surplus every day? Generally speaking, with bulking, I like to try to keep things relatively even. You're never going to be perfectly even. Even if somehow you were able to keep your caloric intake perfectly even every day, your energy expenditure is going to differ from day to day, right? So the idea of being perfect every single day with the same exact surplus is fiction. That's not going to happen. However, if we believe that excess, a small surplus of calories plays a positive role in supporting muscle growth, then we probably do not want to be in a day-to-day caloric deficit for the majority of the week, right? It seems to me fairly intuitive to suggest that that's probably not the ideal way to do it. Now, are you really going to tell a difference? I assume it comes down to exactly how extreme you are with this nonlinear approach. So, for example, if you're in a massive deficit for 31 days straight and then you go on a, 9-day binge of super high caloric intakes, and it just so happens that you end up in a small surplus, I don't think anyone in their right mind is going to say that that's a really good 40-day plan for bulking. And so the question is, where does it become a big enough issue, this kind of variation of surpluses and deficits, where it really starts to matter? I don't know. And since I don't know, if I'm really prioritizing this bulk and I want it to go really well, I want to maximize muscle gain, I want to minimize fat gain, then I'm probably going to try to stay pretty consistent with that small surplus day in and day out, so that on any given day, because muscle growth is happening 24/7, 365, on any given day, I'm putting my body in that physiological state that I'm aiming for, which is plenty of energy around to support growth. All right, just a little reminder, folks. Be sure to hit the like button. We have some kind of weird issue with the computer system here. The number of viewers is larger than the number of likes, which this has happened before, and I keep talking to YouTube about it, and they haven't given me a good answer. They have some wacky ideas about what's going on. Okay, so Mike, let's see here. Let's move on. Ooh, someone's talking about smashing the dislike button in outrage. I don't like that.
I saw that earlier. I didn't handle it well. I had a few minutes of rage.
Yeah, I don't know what that was all about. All right.
You know, Trex, I got one that I saw, and I've been jotting down some thoughts on it. It's related to, it's from Roland. Do you mind if I take out the question here?
Yeah, go for it.
Roland says, does Mike have any fatigue management tips for someone who is interested in training high volume running and bodybuilding concurrently? And so this is a really good question, something that I've been interested in a long time. And so I'm going to stay away from getting into the generic concurrent training answer, which is something we've done here before on mass. And, you know, does the interference effect exist and so forth and that sort of thing. It does exist, right? If you do enough aerobic exercise, it can interfere with your strength, hypertrophy, and power gains. But it's the dosage of training, correct? So it's how much you're doing. If you're just running like 5 miles a week, even 10 miles a week, you're spacing it out appropriately, you're not going to have a big effect. You want to start training for a marathon or running 80 miles a week, it's going to have a negative effect. The good news is, for Roland's questions for fatigue management tips, concurrent training tends to affect hypertrophy far less than it does, let's say, power, and perhaps even less than it does strength. So if your goal is to be a bodybuilder and to run with a lot of volume, while not ideal, I think you'll be more successful at it than, let's say, a high jumper would be if they tried to run long distance and be very good at the high jump, or a pole vaulter or something of that nature. So now when I see high volume, that's a very subjective thing for what somebody's goals are, because high volume for a 5K runner isn't the same as high volume for a half marathoner or for a marathoner or so forth. But I'm going to say high volume in this case is, we're going to give it like 30 miles a week or so, right? That's not a ton of volume, but 30 miles a week, that's probably more than a lot of people who are bodybuilding are certainly doing, obviously, right? So all right, so fatigue management tips. Well, let's say if you're running 30 miles a week, you're probably going to accomplish that through 4 or 5 days of running for this individual. This person is probably going to want to lift there about 3 days per week. So how you space that out is the first fatigue management tip, which is, are you going to perform a high volume lower body resistance training session on Monday and then do your running workout, let's say your intervals for the week, or your long run on Tuesday? The answer to that is no. You might do something like, you're going to run, let's say, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. That's 4 days per week. And then I'm probably going to now see, all right, how am I going to position the rest of my week? All right, so let's say you have a easy run on Monday, you have a workout on Wednesday, you have a long run on Friday, and then you have a recovery run on Sunday. Well, in that case, on Saturday, I'm going to do, let's say, my high volume lower body workout on Sunday, because Monday I have a 5 mile easy run and I don't have any hard running until Wednesday. So I have a long run Friday and I have an interval run on Wednesday. Those are my 2 hardest days. On Sunday, 48 hours after the long run and far before the Wednesday workout, is when I'm going to do my higher volume lower body training, right? So that's the first fatigue management tip, is be very strategic about how you write out that program. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, you're doing your running. Sunday, you're doing, let's say, your high volume lower body. Tuesday and Thursday during that week, you're doing upper body. And then one of the other days, you're doing another lower body session that's not quite as high volume. So it's how you space that out, right? Your upper body sessions are coming the day before your workout, meaning your interval run and your long run. Your high volume resistance training session is coming on Sunday, 48 hours after the long run and a long time before that workout for the week, right? So that's tip one. How are you structuring that program, right? And think of that in a traditional resistance training context, which is, all right, I want to get in 30 sets per week. I'm not going to do 25 sets on one day. I'm going to space them out. I'm not going to do RDLs, the day before I do squats, things like that, how you're going to space those out. So that's number one. And the other thing is if you're doubling, which you're going to do 2 a days here, taking enough time between them, making sure whatever you're prioritizing, you're doing that kind of first, or whatever's harder, you're doing that first in the day. If possible, because aerobic exercise seems to be performance is similar between the morning and the afternoon, I probably perform aerobic exercise really early in the day there for a few reasons. One, aerobic exercise is an effective this afternoon. Two, most of the running you're doing, not all of it, but most is going to be easy, or that quintessential, what we hear nowadays, that zone 2, right? That lower heart rate, easier running, meaning performance on that doesn't matter. Performance and for this running is probably going to matter twice per week, on the workout day and the long run day. So if you have an easy run, do that early in the morning, and then you can do your training later in the day, especially if it's upper body training, which shouldn't be affected by the running that's done earlier in the day. So how you're spacing that out, how you're structuring it is all going to be very appropriate. Then in terms of fatigue management tips, and these are all the very, very basic ones, not necessarily talking about typical recovery modalities. And this is tough. It's so simple, but it is true. It's to eat and it's to sleep. And I know that sounds like, oh, thanks, Zourdos. You just said I need to sleep to be able to recover.
Your PhD teach you that one?
No, I was actually just lack of sleep that taught me that one. And but it is difficult with something like this, because once you start doing that amount of training, a lot of times some of that training needs to happen early in the morning. So if you can, right, if you are able to earlier in the day, if you're waking up super early to train and you're having these doubles, and if you can earlier in the day, get a 20-minute nap in, do it. It will make all the difference in the world, just in how you feel and how your energy level is when you get back, and then for that afternoon session. I wouldn't recommend taking that nap later in the day. Try to get it in early in the day if you can, if that's possible, if you're training this much. And certainly getting in enough food. One thing I found when embarking on really, really high volume running is that it is a bit difficult sometimes to have the appropriate self-regulation in how much you need to eat. And I found that to be more so, at least personally, with high volume running than with lifting, in that sometimes you're not immediately hungry after a run, but you need to eat, especially if you put in, a large amount of miles in one session, or if you have a double because you're like, I don't want to be too full, I have to train again. But what happens is later that night, you're starving and you're getting out of bed to go to the kitchen. And that's when those high fat foods are very enticing to be able to eat. So make sure you're trying the best to have the best self-regulation that you can. You're keeping your hunger satiety in check, and so forth. So all of those, the tip one on this is absolutely how you're structuring everything. If you're structuring everything as such where you are not being using the basic principles of saying, all right, I'm going to space out things, and you're just like, listen, I'm going to do this lower body session heavy Thursday and Friday is going to be my long run, that's not going to work for either of them. But if you're spacing out things appropriately and then keeping all those other things in check, you should be okay. Again, does the interference effect exist? It does. If you're doing really high volume running, it's not ideal for bodybuilding. And it's not ideal for bodybuilding just from the perspective that Roland's asking about, is it's just going to be fatiguing. It's going to be so much training if you're trying to, train for two different, performances, let's say. Now, if you're training, I always give this distinction. This is the last thing I'll say, so I know we need to move on to other questions. I always give the question with aerobic exercise, are you training to compete or are you training to complete? If you're training to complete a race, then you don't need that much training to be able to do that. If you're training to compete in the race and compete in bodybuilding at a high level, it's not ideal, but structuring it appropriately is the best way I'd go about it. Sorry, Trex, I know that was a bit long, but
Hey
hopefully
man, you have an area that you're passionate about, and I support that passion.
sure.
Want to do a little work in the chat here. The Greek Trojan was joking about smashing the dislike button. Good to get some clarity on that. Someone mentioned that Zourdos was cutting out and freezing a little bit there. That individual in the chat who pointed that out passed the test. As I started the episode saying, if you notice any technical difficulties, bring them to my attention. So congrats on winning that challenge. That's just a Wi-Fi thing where the stream over here is doing fine. But we love Mike. We're not going to shame him for having a little bit of lag on his Wi-Fi there. Okay, we got a question here about high-fat diets and testosterone. So someone on the internet said high-fat diet can increase testosterone levels compared to a low-fat diet. By the way, they're attributing that quote to someone, and I danced around who it is. I just don't like to attribute quotes to people when I'm asking the questions unless I heard exactly what they said. You know, I don't want to like paraphrase and then all of a sudden I'm saying someone said something that they didn't, etc. You know how it goes. But anyway, so person said that having a high-fat diet can increase testosterone levels compared to a low-fat diet, but that it's not a huge deal. How true is that statement? Pretty true. I personally tend to frame it the other way. So I usually don't say that a high-fat diet can increase testosterone. I typically say that a low-fat diet can decrease testosterone. And the question to me is, how low is too low? Where do we start to see that effect? Now, normally people will tell you when your fat starts dropping below 20-25% of energy intake, you might see some small reductions in testosterone. Two big caveats there. That reduction in testosterone may not matter at all in terms of any outcome you care about. It may not be large enough to meaningfully impact body composition, libido, muscle growth, anything of that nature. Depends on how extreme the diet is. Second caveat, 20% doesn't really tell me what I need to know about fat intake, right? So it's not like you drop your calories from 3,500 a day to 1,000 and all of a sudden your need for fat plummets. 20% would be a much lower number, and that's why I don't like to go by percentages there. So usually I tell people, hey, if you can afford it within your caloric budget, try to make sure you're getting at least 40, 50, 60 grams of fat per day so that you're supporting normal testosterone production. If you start getting really aggressive with fat restriction, especially on a low-calorie diet, you may indeed find that your testosterone drops a little bit. How much? Probably going to depend on the severity of what you're doing with your diet, and that ultimately is going to dictate how much it really matters. But definitely plenty of truth to that statement. I got a question here. Jake went down from 351 pounds all the way down to 177. That's absolutely fantastic. So Jake said, after the first 100 pounds, I felt amazing, tons of energy, high quality of life. But ever since I got below 190, things have gotten way tougher, lower quality of life, low energy, stuff like that. The question is, do you think it's possible to be past the lower body fat set point, even at around 20% body fat? And if so, what do you do about that, right? So in past episodes, we've talked about the dual intervention point model of body fat regulation. So the lower intervention point is what a lot of people call their kind of lower set point. If someone tells you that they know exactly what's going on here physiologically based on the research evidence, I want to ask them some follow-up questions, because this is a scenario where we just simply don't have a lot of literature to lean on. We don't know exactly how feasible it is to suggest that you can adjust your lower intervention point after a weight loss of 100 pounds or more, because we just don't have these studies where we have 45 people in these two different groups who are all losing 100 pounds each, right? It's just an incredible feat that we don't observe enough in the research literature to really say that we know what a totally typical response and trajectory is in this physiological state. What I would recommend if I were in that position is I would find the lowest weight or the lowest body fat percentage where I felt comfortable, right? And so comfortable is going to vary. For some people, they'd say, okay, like maybe if I'm feeling like 85% of my normal energy level, I'm comfortable there. For some people, they may say, no, I want to get back to 100 and really feel myself. That's really a subjective thing. But if I were in this situation, I would get to the weight that I felt most comfortable at, even if that meant gaining a few pounds. Maybe if I was going from 177 to 183, for example, or 185. And I would just try to maintain there. And instead of focusing on continued weight loss, I would shift my focus to maintaining that weight, but getting stronger, building muscle, engaging in physical activities I really enjoy, maintaining really solid nutritional habits and dietary patterns. And I would just focus on living well at that weight and being athletic and active and enjoying that. And my assumption, my expectation is that you're only going to enjoy the results of taking that approach. And it very well might be possible that after some time of focusing on other things and just kind of maintaining at that weight, you may find that it opens up the opportunity down the road to then reinitiate that weight loss and feel a lot more comfortable doing it and not have such steep and precipitous drops in quality of life. Now, I can't direct you to a study showing you that, that is the population norm. But I think there are a lot of benefits of taking that approach, even if that later weight loss doesn't occur. I do think it makes a lot of sense physiologically and psychologically to shift gears and maintain for a while when you're in this position, focus on other facets of your personal health and fitness level, and then kind of revisit weight loss a little bit further down the line. And when I say a little bit further down the line, I'm talking about months, not weeks. I would really take some time to kind of ease in and settle in at that body weight. Mike, question for you. Two questions, actually, if I may. Number one, someone asked if a person who's doing a bunch of cardio on top of their lifting would need more creatine than just your typical lifter who probably takes, 5 grams a day, give or take. So first of all, what do you think about that one?
So you're going to be the expert on this, but my answer to that would be no, that they don't. If it again, Trex could make me feel dumb here in a moment, but this individual, so we have to keep in mind what creatine is doing, right? And it's replenishing ATP. ATP is very powerful, but it's not for storage, right? So it's not like saying, hey, we're going to then really pack in and store a lot more. It's going to be, need to be replenished at a similar rate. It's going to need to be replenished quickly, which it is, but it's not for storage. So taking more than that isn't going to provide you with excess stores that are then going to be there for you because you're exercising so much more. I would say that it's really no different than if somebody were to just lift more. They're just doing more exercise and they're using more of that usable form of energy. And I don't see any way or any reason or any rationale that going over the 5 grams per day, even I would say, Trex, you could probably get away with 3 grams a day, would be necessary. But make me feel stupid if I am.
No, man, I'm with you. I'm totally with you on that one. The other cardio-oriented question from the same listener, actually. The question was, I've recently taken up cycling again. Is there a theoretical way to have it enhance my leg development rather than viewing it as either a slight neutral effect or a slight negative effect, I should say, on my leg development? So, for example, maybe doing some sprints with high gear ratios or things like that. And I know, Mike, when I hear this question, the first thing I think about is the enormous quads on the people that do competitive sprint cycling. But I'm going to let you answer this one and not just make one of those anecdote kind of meme responses, like when people, when people like show a marathoner and say like, see, running makes your legs small. It's like, well, if you're a marathon runner, you're probably not, squatting for quad growth 5 days a week, right?
For sure. So a lot of those memes and images can be misleading. And I would say in this case, sure, it could be at times, but it's generally not. In that Trex's point is really well taken. In that, yes, you can certainly increase your quad size by cycling. Now, it's just about how you do it. So think about the modality in which you do it, for the questioner here. So if you are going to cycle really, really long distance, you're saying, hey, I'm going to train for the Tour de France, right? Have this crazy goal. I'm cycling through the mountains. I'm going, hundreds and hundreds of miles. Well, by nature, that's not, that's not anaerobic exercise, right? All of the energy systems are active, but you're training oxidative phosphorylation. So think about the type of energy system that you're training, and then you're going to think about the adaptations that you're going to get, right? You're going to get, more asynchronous firing. You're going to get fiber type conversions that are not favorable for, strength and power and so forth. Now, if you're performing cycling, as you said, that are sprints that are with high gears, meaning with resistance, right? That is much more similar to resistance training. Now you're stressing anaerobic glycolysis, right? ATP PCR is high, especially if the sprints are very short in nature. So that is against resistance. It's much more similar to resistance training. You can absolutely increase the size of your quad. So I don't know exactly what the goals are here. If the goals are just say, hey, I want to do any type of cycling, can I increase my my quad size by doing that? Absolutely, if you structure it that way. The way I'm gauging it is, hey, I'm incorporating back cycling, and I'm doing a lot of different type of cycling. How can I still get some muscle gain out of it, even if I'm doing some long distance cycling? Absolutely, sprints can help you with that. But with any mode of exercise, whether it's cycling, and it's the same thing with running, right? If you go out and you train for a marathon and you're putting in 60, 70 miles a week, something like that, no, that's not conducive to getting bigger. But if you're sprinting, right, that is absolutely conducive to getting bigger. And so you can look at this in a way, if we do use kind of an anecdote, but the Olympics were just on, and in our household, we were absolutely glued to the Olympics for the entire time that it was on. And if you watch the men and women that are in track and field, you can see very clearly the muscle mass on the 100 meters sprinters to the 200 meters to the 400 meters to the 800 to the 1500 to the 3000 to the 10,000, right? It's just a gradual decline for the most part and the muscle mass that's on these folks. Now, some of that's due to, hey, I simply need to weigh less. I need to carry a little bit less weight if I'm going to be running the 10,000 as opposed to the 1500 or whatever it may be. But absolutely, you can get bigger by cycling. You could also get smaller by cycling. It's the modality or how you use it. If it's sprints against resistance, for sure. If it's all high intensity and short duration, for sure. If it's all long duration, and you're out there for a long time, then probably not. So it's just about how you incorporate
it. All right, good stuff, man. Yeah, I the thing I always lean on when people are wondering about cycling and leg growth is like, well, you can't. You can at least do as well as those absolute freaks of nature that are doing sprint cycling. And like every time that there's a big sprint cycling competition, people will kind of share a few viral images. It can't be too bad for your legs, based on what I see there. So let's see here, Mike. I had one question I want to answer real quick. So someone asked, if you're trying to gain muscle, what percentage of your protein needs to come from animal sources? That ultimately is going to depend on how much total protein you're taking in. So we've reviewed studies in mass showing if you're eating plenty of protein, so 1.6, 1.8 grams per kilogram per day, or even higher, we've seen studies showing that even on a completely vegan 0% animal-based diet, you can make equivalent gains compared to someone on an omnivorous diet if you're eating above that threshold of 1.6 grams per kilogram of protein per day, plus you're doing a really effective lifting program. So the relative percentage of, I wouldn't say animal proteins, but complete proteins, the relative importance of that ratio gets higher and higher as your total protein intake gets lower. So if you wanted to try to, get as much gains as you could on a very low protein diet, then you would in fact want a pretty high percentage of your protein to come from high quality sources, many of those being animal-based sources. But for most folks who are eating plenty of protein, you actually really don't have to worry about it too much. Just make sure you're getting a nice diverse array of protein sources, whether they're coming from animals or plants. Question here about any truth to the idea of bulletproofing body parts. Heard a lot about this stuff lately. People saying, hey, do these exercises to kind of bulletproof your knees or bulletproof your shoulders or whatever. I think my take on that is that part of it's hype, but part of it, there is some, legitimacy to the idea of, hey, if you have a particular joint or body part or, some physical task where you want to really build robustness, then it does make sense to actually train accordingly and to try to really emphasize what kind of demands are going to be placed on that body structure and train it accordingly. I mean, and that is the essence of training, basically, is, what do I want this body to be capable of? And based on the answer to that question, what kind of stresses and strains do I need to expose my body to in order to build up that capability and that robustness? Now, having said that, some of this stuff's overhyped. Some of this stuff is a lot more complicated than it needs to be. Some of this stuff is overkill. Some of this stuff also completely overstates our ability to necessarily prevent injury just simply by wanting to put the work in. If that were the case, there would not be a lot of folks making $40 million a year to play sports getting hurt, right? If we could just say, oh, well, yeah, we'll just bulletproof the important stuff and that'll work. If that worked, then a lot of billionaires would be a lot happier with the paychecks that they're cutting to people who make $40 million a year and are currently in a walking boot, right? So it's kind of a mixture of, there's a little bit of legitimacy to it because that's ultimately what training is. But there's also a lot of hype and a lot of overstating how complex it needs to be, and also the degree to which we can simply will ourselves to an injury-free career in athletics or, athletic endeavors, so to speak. Mike, are there any additional questions in here that you are that kind of caught your eye before we wrap up?
There were a couple up top here. So there was one I'm remembering off the top of my head about drop sets, and it was saying, should we be adding additional sets to compensate for the difference in volume load versus straight sets? I feel like this is the recommendation from data-driven strength. In terms of data-driven strength,
I don't like those guys.
Well, I never heard of them.
Yeah, neither have I, and I don't like them.
Yeah, right. Already, just come on. So the unfortunately, they've hit the nail on the head once again. And so essentially, should we be adding additional sets to compensate for the volume? Yeah, so that's what the data tends to show, which is that, there's meta-analyses out there and there's original studies out there. We've reviewed a lot of them in mass. When drop sets or really any kind of time-efficient strategy, rest pause sets, whatever it might be, is compared to these straight sets or traditional sets, what we're seeing is that volume, as long as volume is equated, the hypertrophy tends to be similar. And so, yeah, you should be equating for volume, because the biggest thing to get across is that there's nothing magical about any of these time-efficient strategies, about drop sets or rest pause sets or agonist, antagonist, supersets, things like that. It's just that they're very time efficient and they can get training in quickly. So ensure that if you want to get the same growth, you can from those, but you should equate for volume. So if you need to add a set or so, you can do that. And it shouldn't be too difficult because they're so time efficient. If you're always training to failure with those, they could be a bit more fatiguing. So you could do those and train a little bit shy of failure. But the short answer to that is yes, absolutely. One other question here I see, does double progression qualify as a type of DUP? The answer to that is no. These are different concepts. Double progression is a type of let's say, load progression or type of progressive overload. DUP is a programming theory. So if you take DUP or daily undulating periodization, or what I might call daily undulating programming nowadays, it's just a theory of, let's say you're training, to keep it simple, 3 times per week. You do hypertrophy type training one day, power type training one day, and strength type training one day, or 10 reps on Mondays, 7 reps on Wednesdays, and 4 reps on Fridays, changing that stimulus kind of throughout the week. Double progression is a type of progression that's tied to a benchmark, saying that I'm going to do 4 sets this week with 100 kilos on squats. And I'm going to keep doing those 4 sets until I can get 8 reps on all sets. And then I'm going to increase the load. Or once I get all 8 reps, then I'm going to add a 5th set for the following week. So in short, double progression is a type of progression model, or progressive overload, and DUP is a periodization, or really more of a programming theory.
Good stuff. And I don't remember if you mentioned this, but the question about drop sets, there was another question before it that specified, when training for hypertrophy and considering training time efficiency. I don't know if you pitched this, but Mass subscribers have access to your the guide that you put together with Helms, right? The time efficient training strategies.
Not only Mass subscribers, but it is free.
Ooh.
So it's on, yes, it's on our website. If you go to our website and you spend more than, I think, 5 seconds on there, there's a pop-up form, and you'll be able to enter your email and get that guide right away. There's also a page on the website and the bar at the top dedicated to the guide. You can get there. So it is free to read, a free download for everybody, a massive training guide on time efficient training strategies. There's programs built into it with practical examples.
Beautiful. And one final question I want to answer here. Someone said, should someone always move on from meal planning to a more flexible dieting type approach, even if they don't have a problem eating the same meals every day? My answer is not necessarily. So one of the nice things about food variety is that it is a nice little hedge against, gravitating toward kind of atypical dieting habits and patterns where maybe you have some gaps in your diet, some shortcomings where you're missing out on a key micronutrient. That's why a lot of times nutritionists, dietitians, etc. will say, hey, eat a variety of vegetables and make sure your plate's colorful, because vegetables with different micronutrients tend to actually be different colors. So they say, hey, throw in a red thing and an orange thing and a purple thing and a green thing, and you're probably going to be all right. So a lot of times people say, well, you should gravitate toward flexible dieting because most likely you're going to have a greater variety of foods coming in and it'll be good for that reason. But honestly, that's not necessarily the case. There are plenty of people who do flexible dieting and actually reduce the quality of their micronutrient intake and diversity. Also, you could be on a meal plan that's really well structured and covers all your bases with micronutrients. And I can tell you for sure that the bodybuilding prep where I turned pro and made my pro debut, I did not track any macros. I ate the same thing every day. And when I wasn't losing weight quickly enough, I took some out. And I did that for a long time and ended up in stage condition. And that was that. And that was totally fine. And I preferred doing that instead of, doing the Tetris every day with my macros. So absolutely, it's all about finding what is preferable for you and doing it. Implementation. That's the key.
May I draw one parallel on that?
Sure.
Because I fully agree with your answer. And that I think we're, pendulums swing, right? And so we got to a point where with, nutrition, flexible dieting, with training, auto-regulation, and all of these things. And obviously they're fantastic. I've super interested in auto-regulation, of course, utilize it a lot of coaching and so forth. However, personally, I'm someone who coaches individuals, but in my own athletic endeavors, if you can call them that, I am on I'm the person being coached. I have a coach, and I thrive the best when she simply tells me exactly what to do. I don't want, and this sounds a bit hypocritical, all of that auto-regulation in my program for me. I want to open up the spreadsheet. Oh, Sarah said today I run 20 minutes easy. I do 8 by 3 minutes hard at exactly this pace. And then I run 20 minutes easy. And then I go out in the afternoon and I run these exact miles. I don't want it to say, hey, do this, see how you feel, and then add in. I don't want it. It's not where I am in my life with training right now. You know, a lot of people are super busy, so not that I'm busy, but I just want to wake up. I want to see it. I want to go out and execute it and come back. It doesn't mean there aren't days where you just feel absolutely thrashed and like you have to make some adjustments, of course. But and I think it's the same for some with nutrition. They want to see what's on the paper. They want to go in and eat that. They're creatures of habit, and that's outside of if this is the right thing, you know. And I'm not here to comment on, you know, for everybody or healthy for everybody or this or that. But I think there is, even if it's a smaller portion of people, there is something to that for those people adhering to it, whatever it is. And I know from a programming perspective, that's where I am currently. I wasn't always there. I might not always be there like that, but for where I am right now, that's where I like to see. So that's a little parallel. I didn't mean to take us off too much, but just because something is like, you know, scientifically we found these things that they can work, it also doesn't mean that the other thing doesn't work. Like if we look in the literature, and I wrote about this in Mass, like auto-regulation is the way to go in a lot of ways, but the data compared to a fixed program, it's not overwhelmingly positive, right? And if you have a well-constructed meal plan that isn't lacking in micronutrients, and somebody can adhere to, because that's the knock, can somebody adhere to this? But if they can adhere to it, then it's okay.
Yep, definitely. All right, Mike. And I'm like you. I can read the behavioral science and the health behavior psychology stuff and understand it, and then say, but not for me. I like it a different way. In some cases, I'm a lot like that. Okay, Mike. One question I wanted to answer that I totally forgot about. Someone asked about what kind of textbook I would recommend, or we would recommend, for someone who wanted to get into kind of anatomy, especially anatomy as it pertains to like musculoskeletal kind of stuff. So first, I went and grabbed some books from my shelf. So first and foremost, I really like this book here by Schoenfeld, Science and Development of Muscle Hypertrophy. I think it gives a nice overview and kind of touches on, you know, some kind of more functional aspects of what a lot of people are looking for when they start kind of digging into this study of how the body moves, how we ought to train it, and also, you know, feed it in terms of stimulating growth. So I think this is a really fantastic book for people who are generally interested in the kind of applied side of what they're trying to do. In terms of a more like standard anatomy book, not exactly as fun of a read, but I've got this really solid one by Tortora and Derrickson. It's called Principles of Anatomy and Physiology. This is a thick one, not to be taken lightly, but this one's a really solid, detailed, you know, straight to the point anatomy textbook. And while we're getting books out, you know, I gave you the one that's kind of really fun and applied. I gave you the one that's kind of a little more straightforward, maybe a little bit drier. Sometimes you just want to read for fun at night. You want to stimulate your imagination. You want to enjoy yourself. You want to ease into something fun. So for that one, I definitely recommend Libby in Short, Financial Accounting. You know, sometimes when I go on vacation, I just pop this open, pour myself a glass of wine, and you just can't beat it, Mike. Who doesn't want to sit down and read about accounting all day? You know what? You froze right when I asked you that question, and I think that's actually the perfect response. It's just no response whatsoever.
Yeah. Am I here? Am I back?
Yeah, you are back.
So are you reading that on airplanes, and the person next to you is like, hey, what are you reading? And you show them that, and then they just stop talking to you. They're like, all right, I'm going to go back to watching my movie now.
Yeah. It could go one of two ways. You could use it to reflect that you're the most boring person ever, Or when someone asks, what are you reading that for? You say, I really want to stay out of prison. So, and then they're going to talk your ear off.
Yeah, I saw what happened to Irwin Schiff, and I gotta read this.
All right, man. Well, okay. I think that does it for tonight. Really appreciate everyone joining us in the live chat. We got people from all over the place: Chicago, Illinois. We got people joining in from Ontario, Canada. Always an international affair. Thanks everyone for joining us. It's always a pleasure to do this every Wednesday night. I will be back with someone a week from tonight, next Wednesday. So until then, everyone take care of yourselves. Happy lifting. And yeah, we'll see you in a week.